The sound Gabriella made when she hit the renovation floor wasn't dramatic. It was small and wrong, like her body tried to swallow a scream and failed. And the worst part was that everyone kept working for a beat because on a job site, noise is constant. Until I saw her fingers scrabble at the dust like she was trying to claw back a breath she dropped somewhere between the moldy walls and the buzzing drill. And I realized I was about to lose my best friend in a house we'd promised to fix up. Story revealer. The first weeks on that renovation job had felt like stepping into somebody else's life. The kind of work that leaves a grit of sawdust in your hair even after a shower. The kind that makes your forearms ache in a way that's almost satisfying because you can point to it and say, "This is real, this is what I did today." And the house itself was a tired old thing that seemed to breathe in complaints. Creaks underfoot, a groan in the ceiling when the wind shifted. A damp smell that never fully left no matter how many windows we pried open. While Frank, our boss, moved through it like a man wrestling an animal into submission, gruff voice, steady hands, coffee breath, calling out measurements and barking about timelines and permits, and how we were going to turn a rundown place into something beautiful if we stopped staring at the rot and started cutting it out. And maybe that should have been warning right there that we were acting like rot could be negotiated with. But I was new, I was hungry to prove I belonged, and Gabriella, Gabby, because everyone called her that even when she pretended to hate it, had this way of making a disaster feel like a dare. Like if you smiled at the right moment, you could make anything less frightening. So when she shouted my name across the noise, "Hey, Lauren," and waved me over with her paint-stained hand, eyes bright with that reckless kind of joy, it didn't feel like she was pulling me into danger. It felt like she was pulling me into a secret. And I followed her past the stacked drywall and the half-ripped carpet to the bathroom she'd found, the one that smelled like wet pennies and old shampoo and something sour underneath, the one with black streaks crawling across tiles that used to be white, with a cracked mirror that made our reflect. Ions looked slightly wrong as if the house itself couldn't remember faces accurately, and Gabby scrunched her nose and said, "You've got to see this old mold-infested bathroom. It's like a mini horror show." And I laughed because it was easier than admitting the dread sitting under my ribs, because I could already feel the dampness in the air, the way the walls held onto it like a secret, and because we were both still young enough to believe that if something scared you, you could beat it by naming it. So I made a joke about exorcisms, and she made a joke about charging extra for cursed properties, and Frank shouted from down the hall to stop wasting time and get back to demo, and we did, and that's the thing about work that keeps you moving. You can ignore a lot when there's always another task, another nail, another wall that needs to come down, and at first the signs were small. Almost polite, like the house was asking permission before it took something from us, Gabby stepping back a little more often when we kicked up dust, her hand going to her throat when she laughed, her shoulders lifting with a breath she didn't seem to finish. And I noticed because I was always watching her. She was my anchor on that job, the person who made me feel less alone among people who'd been swinging hammers longer than I'd been paying rent. And one day, while I was tearing into a wall with a crowbar and the studs squealed and splintered like a living thing, I saw her turn her face away from the rising cloud, holding her breath too long, and I called out over the noise, "You okay?" And she didn't look at me right away, like she was deciding what answer would keep the day from stopping. Then she said, "Just allergies." With this edge to her voice that didn't match the casualness of the woe. "RD," and she added, "Besides, it's a mess in here, we'll be fine." Like fine was a destination you could reach just by saying it confidently enough. And I should have pushed. I should have stepped into her space and held her gaze and made her tell me what was really happening. But I didn't want to be the person who made things complicated. I didn't want to be the new girl who slowed the crew down. And I didn't want to face the possibility that something invisible in that house was already inside her. So I let her have her answer, and I went back to work and told myself I'd check on her at lunch. And at lunch she was joking again, wiping sweat from her forehead with a sleeve that left a gray streak, chewing too fast like she was starving. And when I asked if she wanted to step outside for fresh air, she rolled her eyes and said, "Outside is just hot and full of mosquitoes. I'll take sawdust." We laughed, and I pretended the little tightness in my chest was just the smell, just the enclosed air, just the normal discomfort of demo. And the week kept moving like that. A string of days stitched together by noise and dust, and the satisfaction of ripping something broken apart. And then there was the morning Frank had us go back into that bathroom, because the plumbing behind the wall had to be accessed, and the tiles needed to come down. And the second we opened the door, the damp smell hit like a slap, thicker than before, and the black streaks looked darker, almost wet, and Gabby made her usual joke. "If I grow a third eye, you're naming it." But her laugh broke into a cough, a rough, scraping sound that didn't fit her, and she braced a hand on the sink as if the room tilted, and I saw it clearly then, the pallor under her tan. the faint sweat at her hairline that had nothing tea. Oh, do with heat, and I stepped toward her and said, quieter this time. Gabby, seriously, are you okay? And she waved me off too fast. I said, allergies, Lauren, stop mothering me. And I felt that mix of irritation and fear, the kind you feel when you care about someone who refuses to be cared for, and I wanted to insist, but Frank was in the hallway shouting that he needed the wall opened before noon. And the crew's footsteps thudded around us like pressure. And Gabby straightened her shoulders with a stubborn little smile, as if she could intimidate her own body into behaving. So I swallowed my worry again and picked up my tools and told myself I'd talk to her after work. And after work, we were both filthy, hair dusty, nails rimmed black, and she looked exhausted in a way that didn't match the day's labor. Like something had been draining her long before she stepped onto the site. And when I offered to drive her home, she said no. She wanted to stop for groceries. She wanted to pretend she was normal. And I let her because I didn't know how to force someone to accept help without making them feel small. And the next day she was late, which was unlike her. And when she showed up, she had sunglasses on even inside the house. And I remember thinking, that's weird, and then laughing at myself for being paranoid. And then the moment came so quickly, I still have trouble believing it happened in real time. We were in the middle of demolition, the air thick with dust, the sound of the drill rattling my bones, and I turned to say something stupid about Frank's mood. And I saw Gabby sway, just a small wobble, like she'd misjudged her footing, and she reached for the ladder beside her, the rickety one she'd been leaning on the first day she called me over. And her fingers missed why an inch, and her face went blank in a way that made my stomach drop. And then she folded, not like fainting in movies, not graceful, just a sudden loss of structure, and she hit the floor hard enough that the tools near her jumped. And for a heartbeat, nobody reacted because everyone's brain was trying to decide if it was a joke, if she tripped, if this was just clumsiness. And then I was on my knees beside her, calling her name, Gabriella, Gabby. Hey, and her eyelids fluttered, and her mouth opened like she was trying to breathe, but the air wasn't cooperating. And the dust around us felt suddenly poisonous. And my hands hovered because I didn't know if touching her would help or hurt. And Frank's boots thundered closer, and he barked for someone to call emergency services. And the crew finally stopped moving, the drills going quiet one by one until the house sounded too empty. And I remember how loud my own breathing was, how my heart pounded like it was trying to punch through my ribs, and I remember Frank's voice snapping at me to move her head so she wouldn't choke. And I remember thinking, I should have taken her outside yesterday. I should have insisted. I should have made her see a doctor. And those should-haves were sharp enough to cut. And when the paramedics arrived, faces serious, movements practiced, they asked questions I couldn't answer. Like how long she'd been feeling sick, whether she'd had a history of asthma, whether she'd been exposed to chemicals, and I kept saying, I don't know, because I didn't, because she hadn't let me know, because we'd both been pretending that discomfort was normal. And when they lifted her onto the stretcher and the blanket covered her dust-streaked arms, I had this surreal thought that she looked like she was being aged away, like the job site had spit her out and we were all supposed to keep going. But I couldn't keep going. I followed them out into the daylight and the sun felt obscene, too bright for what was happening. And Frank grabbed my shoulder and told me to sit down, that the site was shut for the day, that it was going to be handled. But his voice sounded far away, and all I could see was the back door of the ambulance closing. And then it was gone. And then everything that came after felt like living inside an echo. The hospital waiting room with its harsh lights and plastic chairs, the smell of disinfectant replacing sawdust, Frank pacing like a caged bear because he knew there'd be inspections and liability questions, me staring at my hands because they still had dust in the creases like proof I'd been there when she went down, and when the doctor finally came out, tired eyes. Clipped. Words, he told us she'd had a severe reaction, that her lungs were inflamed, that she'd been exposed to something on the job that triggered a collapse, and they were running tests, and I heard Frank swear under his breath, and I heard myself ask, is she going to die? Because that's the question you're never supposed to say out loud, and the doctor didn't answer immediately, which felt like an answer. And then he said they were stabilizing her, that it was too early to say. And I wanted to scream at the ceiling, to claw at the air, to rewind time to the moment she said, just allergies. But time doesn't care what you want, it keeps moving. And after hours that felt like days, they let me see her for a minute, and she looked smaller in the hospital bed, her hair flattened, her skin too pale, an oxygen mask making her face look unfamiliar. And when her eyes opened and found me, there was an jur there first, not relief, and I didn't understand until she rasped, voice raw. You took too long. And my throat tightened because it was unfair and it was also human, because pain needs a target, because fear doesn't know what to do with itself. And I said, I'm here, like that could patch over everything, and she turned her head away like my presence wasn't comfort, it was accusation. And in the days that followed, the story formed in fragments. pieced together by overheard conversations, by Frank's tense phone calls, by Gabby's short, sharp comments when she was awake enough to talk. She'd been getting headaches for weeks, she'd been coughing at night, she'd been waking up wheezing, and she'd told herself it was seasonal, it was dust, it was nothing, because stopping would mean admitting weakness, because work was money, because pride was easier than fear. And I listened and felt. Guilt settled deeper, not because I caused it, but because I was there, because I saw hints and didn't force the issue, because I wanted to be liked more than I wanted to be honest. And then the bigger consequences rolled in like heavy weather, not dramatic, just relentless. The job site was inspected, the house was tested, the word mold became a legal problem, a health problem, a financial problem, and Frank's gruff certainty turned into a brittle edge. Because now he had to answer questions about safety protocols, about protective masks, about ventilation, about whether the crew had been properly trained, and I watched him move from anger to fear to calculation as he tried to protect the business. And I couldn't blame him for wanting to survive, but it was hard to watch him talk about incidents, when the incident was my friend gasping for air. And Gabby's recovery was not a straight line, it was a jagged climb. Days where she seemed stronger, days where she could barely sit up without coughing, days where she cried in frustration because her chest hurt and she hated needing help, and I tried to be there. I brought her favorite snacks. I sat with her when she couldn't sleep. I listened when she ranted about how unfair it was, and sometimes she softened and squeezed my hand like she remembered we were on the same side. And other times she snapped at me for asking if she needed anything, as if my concern itself was an insult. And I took it because I understood she was grieving her own body, her own sense of control. And then the bill questions started, the insurance questions, the paperwork that makes suffering feel bureaucratic, and Gabby's anger found a new shape. And that shape was blame, and one afternoon, weeks after the collapse, when she was finally home but weak, she looked at me with eyes that were too bright and said, "You were right there." And I said, "I know," because I didn't want to fight. And she said, "You saw me." And I said, "I asked if you were okay." And she said, "And you let it go." And that was when it clicked for me that she wasn't accusing me of causing it. She was accusing me of not saving her from herself. And I felt something in me twist because that wasn't a fair job to give a friend. And yet I also understood why she did it, because it's unbearable to admit that you ignored your own warning signs. It's easier to believe someone else should have stopped you. And I tried to say that gently. I tried to say, "Gabby, you told me you were fine." And she laughed without humor and said, "I was lying," and the room felt suddenly too small, and I realized our friendship had become another renovation site, full of hidden rot that had been there long before either of us admitted it, and I kept showing up. But the space between us grew, because every visit was heavy with what we weren't saying. And eventually she stopped returning my messages as quickly. And then she stopped returning them at all. And the last time I saw her in those early years after the collapse was outside a clinic where she'd had another appointment, her face tight with exhaustion. And she looked at me like she was trying to decide whether I was comfort or a reminder, and she chose reminder. And she said, "I can't do this with you." And I didn't know what she meant until she walked away. And for a long time after that, I carried anger like a tool belt I couldn't take off. Anger at her for blaming me, anger at myself for not pushing harder, anger at the house, at the job, at the way life keeps moving even when someone's lungs don't. And you'll to life anyway because you have to. You pay rent, you go to work, you meet new people, you learn new routines, but the memory of that day lived in the background like a low-frequency hum, and then 25 years passed, not neatly, not as a clean fast forward, but as a slow accumulation of time that changes your face and your priorities and your tolerance for unresolved pain, and the message came unexpectedly. A simple invitation to meet at a local coffee shop. And when I saw her name on my phone, Gabriella, I felt my stomach tighten, because there are names that act like doors in your mind, names that open rooms you've kept locked, and I told myself I didn't have to go, that no one could force me to sit across from someone who'd turned my worst day into my fault, and yet my hands typed back yes before my pride could catch up. Because some part of me had been waiting for this even. While pretending I didn't care, and the morning of the meeting the air was cold and smelled faintly of rain, and I walked into the coffee shop with my shoulders tense, scanning for her the way you scan for danger, and I spotted her near the back, hunched slightly over a cup, fingers tracing the rim the same way they used to trace paint cans when she was thinking. And she looked older, obviously, but not in a way that made her unfamiliar. More like time had finally made visible the weight she'd been carrying all along, and when her eyes lifted to mine, I saw it immediately. The guardedness, the pride, the fear under both, and we did that awkward dance of greeting, the half smile, the hey, the thanks for coming, like strangers rehearsing politeness, and I sat down across from her and the chair creaked under me, cheap wood complaining the way old houses do. And for a moment we just listened. tend to the shop around us, the hiss of the espresso machine, the clink of cups, the muffled conversations of people who didn't know they were sitting near a history that still hurt, and I realized my hands were clenched, so I forced them to relax around my own cup. And I said the thing I'd been carrying for decades without ever getting to place it down. Why did you keep saying it was my fault? And my voice came out sharper than I intended because anger. Even old anger knows its lines, and she flinched slightly, not at the volume but at the truth of the question, and she looked down at her coffee and didn't answer right away. And that pause was filled with everything we hadn't said in 25 years. And then she murmured, I guess I needed someone to blame, and the honesty of it landed hard because I'd expected defensiveness. And I felt my chest tighten, as if bracing for impact. Anyway, and I said, that's not fair to me, because it wasn't, because it had never been, because I'd spent years replaying that day and imagining all the alternative versions where I pushed harder, where I forced her to leave, where I did something heroic and decisive, and those fantasies always ended the same way. With me believing I had the power to control a situation that was bigger than both of us. And I said, you went through all that and I was there. But I had no idea it was that serious. And she snapped back, I know that, voice sharpening, eyes finally lifting, and the words hung between us like a suspended weight, and she leaned forward slightly and said, but you were the one present, you were the one who didn't notice. And hearing it again made my stomach twist because it was the same accusation dressed in a slightly more honest outfit. And my first instinct was to F'n myself, to list all the times I asked if she was okay, all the times I offered help, all the times she brushed me off, but something in her face stopped me. Not softness exactly, but exhaustion, the look of someone who has spent a long time arguing with themselves and lost, and she said, it's easier to point fingers, especially when you're hurting. And I felt my anger surge and I heard myself say, you think that makes sense, I cared about you, Gabby. I thought we were in this together. And the shop seemed to dim around us as if the rest of the world politely stepped back, and there was a silence so thick it felt like we were back in that house after the drills stopped. And in that silence, I saw what I hadn't wanted to see for years. Guilt pressing down on her shoulders like a physical thing, not just guilt about blaming me, but guilt about ignoring her own body. About laughing off her own fear, about letting pride write checks her lungs couldn't cash, and I realized my anger had been a shield against a different pain. The pain of admitting that sometimes you can love someone and still be powerless. And I said quietly, voice dropping the way it does when you stop performing toughness, you're not the only one who feels guilty, we all missed something. And as soon as I said it, I felt the old resentment flare. Because why was I offering her comfort when she'd offered me blame? But then her eyes filled with tears, and the sight of them cracked something in me, because tears are the one language that never lies. And she wiped at her face too quickly, frustrated with herself, and she said, I didn't want to blame you, I wanted to understand how I could have let things get so bad. And her voice wavered and she added, but blaming you was easier than facing the truth. And I felt the truth of that sink into me like a heavy stone. This wasn't just about mold or a job site or a medical scare. It was about how both of us handled fear, how we both tried to control chaos by assigning it a shape we could fight. And for years that shape had been me. And in the pause that followed, I could smell the coffee, bitter and warm, and I could hear the rain start against the windows, soft at first and then steadier. And it reminded me of the day in the hospital when everything outside kept moving as if nothing inside had happened, and I realized we were both still living in the shadow of that moment, and I let myself say what I'd never said because I'd been too angry to risk vulnerability. Maybe we should have talked. And I reached across the table slowly, not grabbing, just offering, and I said, about how we felt that day, the fear, the guilt. Maybe if we'd net up, you wouldn't have felt the need to pin it all on me. And my hand hovered near hers, and for a second I thought she might pull away, but her fingers brushed mine, tentative like a test of whether contact would hurt, and she whispered, I would have wanted that. And her voice broke on the last word and she admitted, I couldn't see past my own hurt. And the simplicity of that confession made me swallow hard. Because it meant she wasn't asking me to carry her guilt anymore. She was finally picking it up herself, and I nodded and said, me neither. Because that was also true, because my anger had been a way to avoid grieving. And once you let grief in, it changes you. It makes you softer in ways you can't control. And we sat there with our hands lightly touching like two people learning a new language. And the coffee cup sat forgotten, cooling between us. And I asked her about the years I'd missed carefully, because I didn't want to pry and I didn't want to offer another opportunity for blame to grow. And she told me in pieces, not dramatic, just honest. There were months after the collapse where she couldn't climb stairs without stopping, where certain smells, bleach, dust, damp wood, sent her chest tightening with panic, where she had to leave jobs because the environment made her sick, where she fought with insurers and paperwork and the quiet humiliation of being told she looked fine, And through it all, she carried this simmering resentment, because resentment is easier than admitting you're afraid. And she admitted that sometimes at night, she'd replay the moment she waved me off and wonder why she'd been so determined to appear strong. And I listened and felt my own memories rearrange themselves. Because hearing her speak about fear made me realize much fear had lived inside me too. Not just fear of losing her, but fear of being helpless, fear of being unimportant, fear of failing the people I loved. And I told her things I'd never told anyone, not even myself out loud. How I'd avoided certain houses after that job, how I'd quit renovation work entirely because the smell of damp drywall made my stomach flip. How I'd had moments in unrelated jobs where a coworker coughed too hard and my heart would race, my body convinced it was about to happen again. And she looked at me with something like surprise, then shame, and she whispered, "I didn't know," and I said, "You didn't want to know," not cruelly, just plainly, because sometimes the truth is sharp, but it's still cleaner than silence. And she nodded and stared at the table like she was seeing all the years laid out there. And then she took a breath and said, "I'm sorry." And it W. As different from the apologies people give to end a conversation, it sounded like someone finally setting down a weight they'd been gripping so hard their hands cramped. And I felt my throat tighten because I'd wanted those words for so long. And now that I had them, I didn't know what to do with them. Because apologies don't rewind time. They don't erase the memory of her accusing eyes in that hospital room. They don't undo the loneliness of carrying anger without a place to put it, but they do something quieter. They make room for a new version of the story, one where both people are allowed to be flawed without becoming villains. And I let myself breathe out slowly and said, "I'll never understand why you went through that alone." And she flinched because the sentence implied a truth she didn't want to face, that she had pushed people away, that she had chosen isolation as punishment or herself and others, and I added softer, "But I can understand your pain." And she looked up then, and her eyes held mine in a way they hadn't in years, and I saw the flicker of the friendship beneath it all, the one that had been there in the bathroom mirror the first day, the one that had been buried under blame and pride, and we didn't suddenly become best friends again. It didn't work like that, but the conversation kept moving deeper. Because once you stop guarding a wound, you can finally clean it, and we talked about Frank too, because his name had lived in my memory like a door I'd avoided. And she asked if I'd ever spoken to him again, and I admitted I hadn't, that after the collapse and the inspections and the tension, I'd left that crew and never looked back. And she said she'd heard the company survived but had to change how they worked. And she said she never blamed Frank. The way she blamed me, and that admission stung, and I told her so, and she winced and said, "Frank was easy to hate as a concept, but you were you." And the words were messy and human and not flattering, and I appreciated them more than I wanted to. And as the rain thickened outside, the coffee shop lights reflected in the window like small moons, and we sat there like two people watching weather pass through. And I realized that the house we'd worked on all those years ago had become a symbol in my mind, a place where we tried to fix something decayed without respecting what decay can do. And now here we were trying again, older, slower, more careful, and Gabby said, "I thought if I kept you as the reason, I wouldn't have to face the fact that I ignored myself." And I said, "And I thought if I stayed angry at you, I wouldn't have to face that I couldn't save you." And when I said save, my voice cracked, because the truth is I'd wanted to be her hero as much as I'd wanted to be her friend, and that's a dangerous desire. It turns love into a performance, and she nodded with tears in her eyes and whispered, "I wanted someone to be in charge of it, because if nobody was in charge, it meant it could happen again." And that sentence hit me in a place that had nothing to do with the past and everything to do with being human. Because we all want to believe pain has rules, that if we do the right things it won't touch us, and the hardest truth is that sometimes it touches you anyway. And the breaking point in that conversation came not as a shout, but as a decision I felt in my bones. I could leave that coffee shop still angry, still righteous, still justified, or I could choose something that would feel riskier than anger. Something that would require me to trust a person who had hurt me, something that would demand I let go of the version of myself who was defined by being wronged. And I looked at her and saw how much time had passed, how much we'd lost to silence, and I heard myself say, "I don't want to carry this anymore." And she swallowed hard and said, "Neither do I." And in that moment the choice became real, not forgiveness as a grand gesture, but forgiveness as labor, as construction. As rebuilding with the knowledge of what hidden rot can do, and we made practical promises because that's what adults do when they're trying to heal. We agreed to talk again, not in 25 years, not when guilt forced it, but soon. We agreed to be honest when something felt heavy instead of pretending it was fine. And we agreed to stop using the past as a weapon. And then, because we're both stubborn, we tested it immediately, and I asked her, quietly, Did you ever really believe it was my fault? And she looked at me for a long time before answering, and she said, I believed it when I needed to, and that's the ugliest thing I've ever done. And I felt my eyes sting because the honesty of that hurt, but it also healed because it meant she wasn't asking me to accept a lie to make her feel better. And I nodded slowly and said, Thank you for saying it. And she laughed weakly and said, I don't deserve thanks. And I said, Maybe not, but I needed truth more than I needed punishment. And the words surprised me as I spoke them, because I realized I meant them, and the resolution wasn't a hug or a perfect ending. It was the quiet shift of two people choosing to stop bleeding on each other. And when we finally stood to leave, my legs felt stiff, like I'd been sitting in one position for too long. And Gabby looked at me in the doorway, F the coffee shop, and hesitated, as if she didn't know what version of herself to be in this new reality. And then she said, I kept telling myself you didn't care. And I replied, I kept telling myself you didn't deserve care. And we both flinched at how brutal that sounded. And then she nodded, a small decisive movement, and said, I'd like to try again. And I swallowed and said, Me too. And outside the rain had eased into a mist. The air smelling clean in that way it does after a storm rinses the world. And we walked to our cars separately, not because we weren't connected, but because rebuilding sometimes starts with giving each other space to breathe. And over the weeks that followed, we kept our promise in small, unglamorous ways. Short calls, cautious texts, a second meeting where we didn't talk only about pain, but about ordinary life. And each time the old pattern tried to rise. See, her temptation to deflect, my temptation to harden. We named it, and naming it felt like putting down tools carefully instead of throwing them. And there were moments where grief surprised us, like when she admitted she still panicked in damp rooms, or when I admitted I still held my breath when I walked past construction sites. And we didn't treat those confessions like weaknesses. We treated them like reality, and reality, once acknowledged, became less monstrous. And there was one night, months after the coffee shop, when I found myself thinking about the renovation house again, not with the sharp guilt of should-haves, but with a strange tenderness, because that's where we learned what we were capable of ignoring, and that knowledge, painful as it was, had shaped how we lived afterward. And I realized something that felt almost like a final reflection settling into place. Sometimes the hardest part of caring for someone isn't the dramatic moment when they fall, it's the quiet days before, when the warning signs are subtle, and the world is loud, and you're afraid of being the one who makes things inconvenient. And sometimes the hardest part of being hurt isn't the injury itself. It's the way your mind scrambles to assign blame so you don't have to sit with randomness. And if there's any lesson in what happened between me and Gabby, it's that blame can feel like control, but it's a false kind of control. It costs you years, it costs you tenderness, it costs you the chance to build something honest. And honesty is slower, it's heavier. It doesn't give you the instant rush of righteous anger, but it gives you something sturdier, something you can stand on without collapsing. And when I look back now, I don't see a villain and a victim. I see two scared women in a moldy age, whose pretending fear was just dust. I see a friend hitting the floor and another friend frozen for a heartbeat too long because she didn't know how to fight something she couldn't see. I see pride, denial, and then, decades later, I see a coffee shop table where we finally stopped pretending we were made of stone. And I can't change what happened. I can't rewrite the moment I asked, You okay? And accepted just allergies as if that was enough. But I can choose what happens now. And what happens now is that I don't let silence do the work blame used to do. I don't let old anger build walls I'll have to tear down later. And when Gabby texts me on a bad breathing day, I don't offer fixes, I offer presence. And when I have my own nights where the memory rises, I don't swallow it, I name it because naming it keeps it from owning me. And that's where I leave this, not with a neat ending, but with a real one. We're still building, slowly, carefully, with the kind of attention we didn't have when we were younger. And maybe that's what healing looks like for people like us. Not a sudden transformation, but a series of choices that make the next day less haunted than the last. And if you're listening and you're carrying an old blame that's turned into a permanent room in your mind, consider this a quiet invitation to open a window, to let some air in. To speak what you've been swallowing, because the body keeps score, friendships keep score, and time will keep moving whether you face the rot or not. So you might as well face it while you still have the chance to build something new.